Picture a gym. Now take away the machines. Take away the barbells, the treadmills, the mirrors, the playlist. Take away the concept of working out entirely. No one in the ancient world ever walked into a room specifically to get stronger. There was no leg day. There was no rest day. There was no protein shake waiting in a cooler bag. And yet, skeletons pulled out of the ground, tens of thousands of years old, tell a very different story than you'd expect. Bones so dense, so reinforced, so thick with the evidence of raw physical force, that some of them rival the skeletons of modern elite athletes. Not soldiers, not bodybuilders, ordinary people, farmers, foragers. Mothers grinding grain by hand for hours a day. So how did a species with no concept of exercise end up with bodies engineered like this? The answer isn't willpower. It isn't genetics alone. It is something far simpler and far more brutal. They didn't train their bodies. Their bodies were built by everything they had no choice but to do. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at a gym the same way again. Let's start with the single biggest misunderstanding in this entire topic. Ancient humans did not exercise in any sense we'd recognize. Exercise as a concept requires something ancient life rarely offered: a surplus of time. A surplus of safety. A surplus of calories you could afford to burn for no immediate reward. Modern exercise is a person with enough food and enough free time choosing to create physical stress on purpose because their daily life no longer provides it naturally. Ancient humans had the opposite problem. Their daily life was the stress, walking for hours to find food, carrying water, firewood, children, and carcasses across uneven terrain, digging, climbing, throwing, dragging, lifting. None of it was optional. None of it had a name. It was just Tuesday and Wednesday. And every day after that for 100,000 years. They weren't training. They were living inside a workout they could never leave. So what did a single day of that workout actually demand of the body? Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania have measured something remarkable. On a typical day, a Hadza forager might walk somewhere between 8 and 15 kilometers. Picture that as roughly the distance from your house to the far side of a small city. On foot before lunch, not on flat pavement. Across rocky ground, uphill terrain, dense brush, and riverbeds. Carrying tools, carrying food, often carrying children. And this wasn't a special event. It was simply how a Tuesday looked and had looked for tens of thousands of years before that. Compare that to a modern office worker's daily step count, and the gap isn't small, it is staggering. But here is the twist. Distance alone doesn't build strength. Distance builds endurance. Strength needed something else entirely, something that doesn't show up in a step count at all. It shows up inside the bones themselves. Your skeleton doesn't lie about how hard your life has been. Bone is not a static material. It is alive. It responds to force the way a muscle does, thickening in the places under regular stress and staying thin in the places left alone. This is called Wolff's Law, and it means your skeleton is quietly taking notes on every hard day you've ever had, which makes ancient skeletons something closer to a diary written in calcium. And what that diary reveals is startling. In a widely cited 2017 study, researchers compared the arm bones of Neolithic farming women from roughly 7,000 years ago to the arm bones of modern women, including elite athletes. Here is the wait. What? Moment. The ancient women's bones weren't just stronger than typical modern women's bones. In several measures, they beat the bones of living female rowers, athletes who train on rowing machines for hours a week, chasing exactly this kind of strength on purpose. Grinding grain by hand for hours a day for years on end, had quietly built forearms tougher than a training program most modern athletes would consider extreme. No coach, no program, just repetition forced by necessity for an entire lifetime. And if grinding grain could do that to an arm, what could hunting do to a whole body? It wasn't only the women's studies of Neanderthal skeletons show a similar pattern, but pushed even further. Neanderthal arm bones, particularly in the right arm, show asymmetry in density levels researchers have compared to the throwing arms of professional athletes, and in some cases surpassing them. Try to picture it. A skeleton so lopsided with muscle memory that 40,000 years later scientists can tell which arm did the killing. The leading explanation involves close-range hunting. Thrusting spears into large animals at close distance repeatedly across a lifetime doesn't just build muscle. It reshapes bone. It leaves a signature that survives for over 40,000 years buried in dirt waiting to be read. Homo erectus skeletons dating back over 1 million years show the same pattern going even deeper in time. Thick cortical walls pronounce muscle attachment sites, evidence of bodies under constant, serious mechanical load from childhood onward. This wasn't a rare exception hiding in the ancient world. It was the baseline. Strength wasn't something they built. It was something that happened to them, whether they wanted it or not. So if gyms didn't build these bodies, what did the average ancient day actually consist of? Let's break down the real exercises of ancient daily life, the ones nobody ever called exercises at the time. Carrying, not a gym bag. Carcasses hauled back to camp, sometimes for kilometers, sometimes uphill, sometimes with a tool in one hand and a child in the other arm. Digging roots and tubers don't leave compacted earth willingly. Digging with wooden sticks or bone tools for food was a daily, repetitive, full-body task, closer to swinging a pickaxe than pulling a carrot. Throwing spears thrown repeatedly at moving targets at real force, because missing meant going hungry, not losing a point climbing. Trees for fruit, escape, or shelter. Rock faces for a lookout, or for survival grinding. Horrors spent processing grain or seeds by hand between stones, a task so repetitive it left visible wear patterns, not just on the tools, but on the human skeleton itself. None of these looked like a workout. Each one on its own looks almost boring, but stacked daily for decades. From childhood onward, they produced something modern fitness culture now spends enormous money trying to recreate artificially, which raises an obvious question. If ancient life built strong bodies automatically, why does modern exercise even need to exist? The answer is that we remove the load, not the requirement. Human bodies still expect the same mechanical stress they evolved under. We just no longer supply it through daily survival. So we recreate small, controlled versions of it in gyms and call it exercise. A deadlift, in a strange way, is a modern echo of lifting a carcass off the ground. A farmer's carry, holding heavy weights in each hand and walking, is almost a direct simulation of hauling water or firewood across a campsite. Rucking, walking with a weighted pack, mimics exactly what a forager's body did every single day, long before it had a name or a hashtag. Modern fitness didn't invent new movements. It engineered old ones, movements the human body was built around long before the words exercise or workout existed. We didn't discover new ways to get strong. We rediscovered the old ones and had to schedule them back into lives that no longer demanded them. But movement alone doesn't explain everything. There is a second ingredient hiding in this story, one you'd never guess from the bones alone. Strength wasn't only built through labor. It was built through diet in ways easy to overlook. Ancient diets, especially among hunter-gatherer populations, were often higher in protein relative to overall calories than the modern average diet. Meat, when available, organ tissue, fish, insects, in some regions, all supplied the amino acids muscle repair and bone density actually run on. This doesn't mean every ancient population ate abundant meat every day. Diets varied enormously by region, season, and available resources, and real, dangerous scarcity was common. But the combination of frequent physical load and a diet, generally rich in the nutrients needed to rebuild tissue, created conditions modern strength coaches would recognize instantly. Stress the tissue, feed it enough to rebuild stronger, repeat. For a lifetime, ancient humans weren't doing this deliberately. They were doing it because it was the only way to eat and the only way to move available to them. You'd think then that farming, with its steady food supply, would have made bodies even stronger. The opposite happened. Then came agriculture, and something changed. Skeletal studies show a measurable decline in bone robusticity when populations shifted from foraging to farming. This seems backwards. Farming is physical work. Shouldn't farmers have been just as strong or stronger? The explanation researchers point to is variety. Foraging demanded a huge range of movement patterns: running, throwing, climbing, carrying, digging in different directions at different intensities. Across unpredictable terrain, farming, by contrast, concentrated physical stress into narrower, more repetitive patterns, tilling, harvesting, processing grain hard work, but the same work in the same motion over and over. And bones, like muscles, respond to variety, not just volume. A body doing 15 different demanding tasks a week builds differently than a body doing 3, even if the total effort adds up the same. Agriculture didn't weaken humanity, it just narrowed it into fewer, more repetitive shapes, and that narrowing points to something even more important than adult labor, where all of this strength actually began. Because so far we've only talked about adults. But the story of ancient strength doesn't start in adulthood. It starts in childhood decades before anyone would call it training. Modern children spend most of their waking hours sitting, at desks, in cars, in front of screens. Sometimes 7 or 8 hours a day by the time you add it all up. Ancient children barely sat down at all. Movement wasn't a subject in their day. It was the day toddlers followed adults. On foraging trips long before they could contribute anything useful, just absorbing the terrain, the pace, the constant low-level physical demand of walking beside people who weren't going to slow down for them. Older children carried smaller loads. Water firewood, younger siblings, they climbed for fun, which was also climbing for practice. They threw things at targets, which was also throwing for future hunting. They ran, chased, wrestled, balanced, and fell over and over on uneven ground that never once resembled a padded gym floor. None of it was structured. None of it needed to be a nervous system exposed to that much varied movement that early and that consistently builds coordination, balance, and joint stability that is difficult to recreate later in life. No matter how disciplined the training program, ancient humans didn't start getting strong in their 20s. They started in their second year of life and never really stopped. Which brings us to a part of this story modern fitness culture obsesses over, but ancient life handled completely differently: recovery. Modern fitness culture talks constantly about rest days, sleep, and recovery windows, treating them as a specialized, almost clinical part of training. Ancient life had recovery too, but it looked nothing like a scheduled day off. It looked like the natural rhythm of scarcity and abundance. A successful hunt might be followed by a day or two of lighter activity, processing meat near camp, letting the body recover while there was finally food to justify the pause. A poor foraging day might force a shorter, lower-intensity outing the next day, simply because energy reserves were running low. There was no printed schedule to follow. The body simply responded to yesterday's reality, the same way a wild animal's energy naturally rises and falls with what is actually available to it. That unstructured, need-based recovery may have prevented more overuse injuries than any modern program manages to. No coach was there to demand one more rep through the pain. If the body was exhausted, the environment forced a slower day, whether anyone liked it or not. Necessity built the workout. Necessity also built the rest. But movement, food, and rest still aren't the whole picture. There is one more stressor working on the body around the clock, one most of us never experience at all. Cold exposure is another overlooked contributor, and one modern researchers interested in resilience training keep circling back to. Ancient humans, especially those living through Ice Age winters or in northern latitudes, faced repeated, unavoidable cold that no modern indoor life comes close to. This wasn't a wellness practice, it wasn't 3 minutes in a cold plunge tank followed by a warm towel and a podcast. It was hours, sometimes days of genuine cold stress with a real chance of dying if you got it wrong. Populations like the Inuit, studied extensively by physiologists, show measurable metabolic adaptations to cold, more efficient heat generation, altered blood flow to the extremities, developed over generations of continuous exposure. Repeated cold stress, stacked on top of repeated physical load, appears to compound, affecting cardiovascular function, brown fat activity, and stress hormone regulation all at once. None of this was understood by the people living through it. They weren't optimizing anything. They were surviving in a world that never once turned the thermostat up for their comfort, and their bodies adapted because the alternative was death. There is one more clue hiding in plain sight, one you can actually check on your own hand right now. Grip strength deserves its own mention because it is one of the clearest fossils of ancient labor still visible in the human body today. Modern grip strength has been declining for decades, a trend documented across multiple countries and age groups, and researchers keep pointing to the same underlying cause. We simply don't grip heavy, awkward, resistant objects with our hands anymore, the way almost every ancient task required: gathering, digging, climbing, hauling, and tool, making all demand sustained, forceful grip, often on irregular surfaces that don't allow for an easy hold. A hand built for gripping a smooth phone screen is a very different tool than a hand built for gripping a wet, uneven branch 15 feet off the ground while carrying weight. Some researchers now treat grip strength as a surprisingly reliable predictor of overall health and longevity. In some studies, tracking survival about as well as far more familiar measures like blood pressure, precisely because it reflects a kind of full-body physical engagement most modern lifestyles have quietly phased out. Ancient humans didn't train grip strength. They couldn't avoid it. Every single day handed them another reason to hold on tightly to something that did not want to be held. Which brings us to the real point buried underneath all of this. The story of ancient strength isn't really about ancient humans being superhuman. It is about consistency without an off switch. Modern humans can actually train harder in a single hour than almost any ancient forager did in a single hour. We can lift more raw weight, generate more concentrated force in a much shorter window of time. What we struggle to replicate is decades of unavoidable, varied, moderate load applied daily from childhood into old age with no rest days built in, because no one had invented the concept of a rest day yet. Ancient strength wasn't peak strength, it was permanent strength. Not the strength of someone training for a competition, but the strength of someone who simply couldn't survive without it. And that permanence, it turns out, didn't stop at middle age either. Modern strength training is often framed as something that fades with age, something you fight to hold on to after 40, 50, 60. Ancient life didn't really offer an off-ramp from physical demand, and the record shows exactly what that meant. Studies of hunter-gatherer populations, including the Hadza and various sand communities in southern Africa, show older adults staying physically active well into what modern societies would call advanced old age, still walking long distances, still foraging, still pulling real weight in the group's labor. This wasn't stubbornness. It was structural. A group's survival often depended on every capable body continuing to contribute, and an elder who knew exactly where food hid in a bad season was too valuable to sideline just because their pace had slowed. Elders didn't stop moving because the environment never stopped asking them to. And bodies that never fully stopped being asked to move seem to have held onto strength, bone density, and mobility much later into life than sedentary modern populations typically manage. This doesn't mean ancient old age was easy or that every elder stayed strong. Injury, illness, and simple bad luck could end that story early for anyone. But for those who stayed healthy, aging didn't automatically mean physical collapse, the way it so often does now. The body kept being used, so the body kept working. Use it or lose it isn't a gym slogan. It is the oldest rule the human body has ever followed. Which finally clears up one of the biggest misconceptions about ancient people altogether. We tend to imagine early humans as either impossibly tough or fragile and short-lived. The truth sits somewhere else entirely. They weren't invincible. Injuries were often catastrophic without modern medicine. A broken leg in the wrong environment could be a death sentence. But within the limits of what their environment demanded, their bodies were remarkably well adapted to meet it. Not through willpower, but through the simple repeated mechanics of daily necessity. They weren't stronger because they wanted to be. They were stronger because weakness had consequences their environment never forgave. There is one last myth left to clear up before we close this out, and it might be the biggest one of all. The image of the ancient human as a brute, all raw power and no finesse, isn't really supported by any of this. Raw power wasn't actually the point functional, varied, durable strength was. The kind that lets you carry an awkward load over uneven ground for an hour, then climb a tree, then throw with accuracy, then walk for 3 more hours, then do it all again tomorrow. Modern strength sports have started circling back toward exactly this idea: functional fitness, strongman style training. Farmers carry sandbag lifts, sled pushes, movements chosen specifically because they mimic awkward real-world loads instead of clean, isolated gym movements. Coaches in these disciplines will often say the goal isn't to move the most weight in the most controlled way possible. It is to move an inconvenient weight in an inconvenient way and still get the job done. That sentence, more than almost anything else in this video, describes ancient daily life with total accuracy. We didn't just rediscover old movements. We rediscovered the old logic behind them. Strength that serves a purpose, not strength for its own sake. So how did ancient humans become strong without exercise? They didn't skip exercise. They lived inside it. Every carried carcass, every thrown spear, every hour spent grinding grain between stones, every uphill walk with a child on one hip and firewood in the other arm. None of it had a name. None of it needed one. Their bodies weren't the result of a program. They were the result of a lifetime, with no alternative. And somewhere in that unglamorous repetition, carrying, digging, throwing, walking day after day for years, that turned into decades, the human body was quietly built into something modern training still tries to imitate. So picture that gym again, the one from the very start of this video. The machines, the mirrors, the barbells stacked against the wall. Every single one of them is a modern attempt to recreate a Tuesday our ancestors never had a choice about. We built machines to simulate the work our ancestors couldn't avoid. We call it fitness now. They just called it living no program. No goal date, no mirror to check progress in. Just a body, asked for everything it had every single day, for as long as that day happened to last. And somewhere underneath every rep you've ever counted, that same old debt is still waiting to be paid.